Hang tight. Trying to work new technology, which is usually not a good, usually does not work for me. Okay. Hang tight. Trying to see. Okay. So again, today's learning is sponsored, like I said, in honor of Bernard Lipsey's birthday. Happy birthday to Bernard. I'm going to send right now in the chat our source sheets so you could follow along like that, or I'll also share my screen. It really is so wonderful to see all of you here. It's been a bit of a minute since we got a chance to be together and study together, but we're back on a regularly scheduled program. And you'll notice in the Shabbat newsletter, we put out a list of all the coming topics for the classes for the next few weeks. We'll be dancing around different, if I had to give an overall theme, I would say it's kind of like Jewish values. So we're talking about different things. Today we'll talk about family as one of as a Jewish value. In the coming weeks, please keep a lookout for different topics, and they'll often tie into the Parsha, but I wanted to put a little bit more order to our learning. So with that, let me share my screen. Hang on, just make this fit. Can you all see my screen?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So I want to start today's learning by asking just a basic question. Let's take a look at the beginning of our Parshat Noach. So we know that the story of Noach and the flood, we know that Noach, so we start again with the story of Noach and the flood. And so we know that at the very beginning of the story, God sees that the world has not gone well, and decides in the first, in verse 17 in chapter 6, Pasuk Yud Zayin, follow along with me in box number 1. V'ani hineni mevi et hamabul mayim al haaretz l'shachet kol basar shabo ruach hayim mitachat hashamayim kol asher ba'aretz yigva. Right, so God says, I'm going to destroy the entirety of the world. And just so we understand what we're talking about here, this is not just God saying that he's going to wipe out something small or bring upon an affliction upon the earth. That's not what we're talking about. Everything that God has created that we read about in last week's Parsha, the entire story of creation, God is now saying he's going to wipe out and destroy everything. And then he says to Noach, V'akimoti et briti itach, I, however, am going to make a covenant with you, uvata el hateva, ata uvanacha v'ishtecha v'neshev anach itach. But you shall enter the ark with your sons, your wife, and your sons' wives. Your whole family is all going to come. And in addition, mikol achai mikol basar shnai mikol tavi al hateva lachayot itach zachar nekeva hiyu. You should also take 2 of every living creature will come living with you, male and female, eventually to repopulate the earth. 2 of everything. Take everything that you need to eat and bring it all into the ark. And so Noach does exactly as God commands him to do. Now, one of the unique elements that stands out in the story that is that we don't spend a lot of time talking about is the story of Noach and the flood. But what we don't really spend a lot of time talking about are some interesting characters, which is Noach and his family. In other words, why is it that God commands Noach to bring with him his entire family? What is it that's so significant about them, in addition to Noach, that they should come with them too? You understand the question? Why doesn't God save Noach's family too?
To perpetuate the generations so that they can continue to flourish.
So good. So there could be a pragmatic answer, which is that God wanted to make sure that there could be future generations. Although, to be fair, we are talking about God who literally could create anything from nothing and could recreate mankind the same way he would recreate the world. But there is certainly a pragmatic position which suggests exactly that God needed to have it continue. So why take also their children? So
didn't he want the continuous link from?
Why not ask Noach to start fresh with his wife?
Maybe she was so fresh.
So the commentaries actually suggest that these children and family, wives, were saved because of Noach, which is very interesting. We actually I just remembered a few years ago, we actually studied about how the story of Noach is literally a recreation of the entire world. He waits for 7 days. There's 7 days of creation. So this is literally a second creation. But what's fascinating is that if you look carefully in the Parsha, you will notice how time and again we see a reference to not just Noach, but to Noach and all of his children as well. So for instance, look at the next source. Again, there's a lot of sources here, but they're not particularly long. They're just a lot of psukim. And if we had a chumash, it'd be a lot easier, but we're studying virtually here. Look how the Torah describes it further in chapter 7. So right after this, Noach does everything that God tells him to do. Vayomer Hashem leNoach, God now sends to Noach, Bo ata v'chol beitecha al hateva. I want you and your entire household to come, ki odcha ra'iti tzadik lefanai bedor hazeh, because you I have found righteous before me in this generation. So what's the question on this pasuk, obviously? What about the rest of his family? Are they not righteous? And this is the proof that, in fact, Noach himself is righteous, and his righteousness is what carries over for everybody else in his household. But yet you'll notice that whereas right over here, the Torah is very explicit and uses the word what? Beitecha, uses the word household. Notice that it continues to tell us, once again at the bottom, Vayavo Noach uvanav ishto uneshem vanav ito el hateva mipnei mei hamabul. That Noach explicitly, his sons, his wife, his sons' wives, they all enter the ark because the waters of the flood. And we already found out a way. The Torah could have just said Noach and your household. The Torah could have told us over here, Noach and his household went into the teva. They went into the ark because of all of the floods. And yet the Torah is very explicit in telling us that all these different people who are coming with him, who is in his family. There is this enormous focus throughout the entire story of Noach's family, which, if you think about it, is almost unnecessary to the story of the flood itself. If the flood is, the whole purpose of the flood is that God is angry with humanity and needs to restart the world, who cares about the details of his family? Okay, tell us one time, and then just tell us Noach and his family were saved. Why do we keep on emphasizing his children and their wives, etc.? And it's not just there that we find this focus on family, but something very interesting comes up as well, where in the second pasuk here, in the second verse in chapter 7, Mikol habema haTorah tikach lecha shiva shiva, ish ve'ishto. You should take 7 pairs. How does the Torah here refer to these pairs? Males and their mates. Ish ve'ishto. Again, husbands and wives. Now, I don't know, I don't have too many friends that are in the animal kingdom that I could call and ask, but last time I checked, animals don't have spouses. There is not a man and wife, there wasn't a dog wedding that I went to. Well, there may have been a dog wedding in some places, but there hasn't been one that I've officiated at, though that does remind me of some great jokes about dogs who—
Rabbi, there are animal species that are monogamous. They pick a mate for life. Some of the penguins, and there's a lot of walruses and things like that. They do pick, even though they're not have a marriage ceremony, they do pick a spouse for life, and they stay with that one spouse.
Yeah, I think you're making a really good point, right? I think you're saying something great, which is that such a thing does exist. But this is all of the creations. This is all of the animals that God created, right? It's not just the few that are monogamous. In other words, but the Torah here is emphasizing again this notion of family, right? Ish ve'ishto, a family went into the ark. Whereas previously, if you look back in those verses, how is it referred? Zachar and nekeva, male and female. So if the Torah wanted to tell us just that there were male species and female species that all went onto the ark, the Torah would just tell us that, as it did. But when the Torah uses this unique language of ish ve'ishto, man and his wife, it is creating the imagery of family, which is interesting that the families themselves seem to be entering into the ark. Whether they actually are, monogamous or not, there is this picture that God is trying to save something. In other words, trying to save families, trying to save Noach's family, and also trying to save the families of all the species of the earth. And the question is why? What is the significance of family that God is trying to save this? What is the Jewish perspective on family in general? And what is its significance vis-a-vis this story and just our lives in general? And so with that, I want to actually go deeper, and I want to continue by looking at the story of the first family, if you will. What we looked at last Parsha, the story of the creation of man and his wife, etc. So Adam and Chava. So the story goes like this. Vayikra Adam Shem Ishto Chava, box 3, ki hu haita im kol chai. We saw previously in chapter 2, man goes around and actually names all of the different animals. And that's what he does. And then when he can't find an animal, a mate for himself, God says, Lo tov hadam, lo tov hayot hadam levado asa lo ezer kenegdo. It's not good for man to be alone. Let me make him a partner. He couldn't find a partner. Let me go find a partner. And he takes from his rib and creates a woman. But his wife, woman, does not have a name until chapter 3, which this text comes right after the sin of the eating of the tree of knowledge. And he calls her what? Chava. Adam and Chava, Chava also known as Eve. And we see that the Medrash actually tells us that that when selecting and choosing a name for each of these animals, said Ravacha, on the hour that the Holy One came to create the humans, he ruled together with the ministering angels, and he said to them, let us make man, human, in our image. And they said, this one, what good is man? Man is nothing. We are angels, right? His wisdom is greater than yours. So God brought before them beast and animal and birds, brought in front of all the angels, and said, what are their names? And the angels couldn't come up with names. But when they passed it before Adam, sure enough, Adam was able to name each and every single one of these animals. But more than naming the animals, it takes a step further. He names God himself as Adonai, and that is the name that God is referred to. So it's not just that Adam is just a really good namer. He's not just good at naming names, but more than that, Adam actually has this ability, this like divine ability on a higher level, this wisdom, more so than angels, in giving creatures its name. And so if he gives the name Chava to his mate, to his partner, what is the significance? Why is it called Chava? Ki hi haita im kol chai. Because she was what? The mother of all living things. So what does that mean? What is the significance of the name Chava? So the Rashi tells us you can take out the Vav. Vav and Yud can be interchangeable. So the word Chava could really mean Chaya, Chaya meaning animal. So what does it mean, though, that she was named? And again, this is a divine name according to the Medrash. That the name that Adam gives her is something that is very spiritual and significant to her identity. So what does that mean to be the mother of all living things? What do you think? What is God's plan for all of humanity at this point? I can tell by your thinking that you obviously know the answer and that you don't want to embarrass me with my silly question. So I'll just give a potential answer while you keep thinking. So there are really two possibilities here. One is that literally all future generations were going to come from her. Now that could mean, like I said, two things. Either she was literally going to birth every future generation, or alternatively, she was going to be the first person to have all these other children, and they would have children. But the significance here is that there is, and by the way, Rashi, let me just take you back here for 1 second. Rashi here tells us down here that this naming actually happens before the sin of the garden, meaning when she already had her two sons. She was already the mother of two sons, obviously, and that all happens, all this happens prior to the sin. But it is interesting to note that this naming also does tie into this question over here, that right after she is named, the Torah tells us that God gives them garments of skin, meaning God clothes mankind right at this moment. And I did see an interesting idea here that this name, the naming, if you follow it chronologically, not topic-based, but chronologically, just from the text, what's in the text itself. So right before these verses is, like I said, the sin of eating from the tree of knowledge. So it could be that even though because of woman's decision and following the trickery of the serpent, even though now mankind is now going to die, in other words, death has now been introduced to the world. So what could Adam have called her? He could have called her a lot of other things, if you know what I mean, right? He could have been pretty angry at his wife for creating this terrible situation that is causing them to be thrown out of the Garden of Eden. And yet, he calls her what? Chaya, Chava, calls her Aim Kol Chai, right? He says something positive about who she is and doesn't call her, for example, the mother of all death or the mother of my problems or the source of all evil. It's a good life lesson. Don't speak to your wife in that way. Speak to her only in positive ways. And one possibility could be that right after this, God comes in the same way that Adam shows kindness and sensitivity given this difficult circumstances to his wife by saying something positive. It could be that in the same way that he's covering up Chava's big mistake, that God also kind of covers up something that's embarrassing for man, which is he clothes man in this moment. So there could be a correlation to that. But either way, we see that there seems to be a blueprint for what God wants to create, which is one unified family. Aim Kol Chai. There'll be one mother for this entire family, whether it's one physical mother who's going to birth all these future generations, or more likely just one mother and one family, but there's one united family that's going to create. That is the model that God creates and starts the world with. But what we see is that this model leads to problems. Well, what kinds of problems do we see? Well, Cain and Hevel, they don't get along too well, right? There's strife in the relationship. Cain kills his brother Hevel. But more than just killing Hevel, we see right before the destruction of the world, how does the Torah refer to this? Man begins to increase on the earth and has many daughters. These divine beings, or maybe the judges of the time, big machloket on what this means. They see these girls, kitovot hina, because they are good. They took women anywhere they wanted. Lord says, my breath shall not abide in man forever, since he is too flesh, right? I will only let him live for 120 years. And then skip 2 verses. God sees that this is not working. It literally is not working. And he sees in the ultimate act of desecration of the family unit, which is people just taking wives left and right, women left and right, and the whole family unit has been totally destroyed. And so God realizes that he needs to start fresh. And he starts with what? One family. Literally coming back to our first sources here, he takes one beito, one household. And so in other words, God tries to make one unified family. It doesn't work. He says, obviously my model doesn't work. Let me try a different model. So he goes and tries with Noach. And perhaps this is why there's such an emphasis on Noach and this entire story on his family, because it's not just a story of the destruction of mankind for their sins. Rather, it's a story of God trying to create a model of family, or I don't want, maybe family values, if you will, that are going to keep the world going. And it has fallen apart between Cain killing Hevel, between the Bnei Elohim taking the Benot Adam, taking the women of the earth, and desecrating the values of this family unit. So everything is falling apart. So the story of Noach is not just of people doing bad and doing Hamas, which is the beginning of our Parshat, doing bad things, robbery or sexual immorality. It rarely has to do with the destruction of family itself. And so God chooses one family. And like I said before, when he takes the family, we see that, let me take you over here. Again, by say Noach uvanav ishto in verse 7, banav ito, They all walk out, right? The whole family leaves. And how do they walk out? At the end of the flood, how do they leave? The animals leave according to their families. They each take upon themselves their unique species. And so God says, okay, we're going to start separate now. We're going to have just, instead of having one family, well, maybe we'll have just individual families, and we'll see how that works. Lots of individual species. Each species kept to their unique family, and Noach's family keeps to their family. Everybody stays totally separate. Maybe that's a better model, God says. And so let's continue here. What's the next part of our parsha, or the end of our parsha? Well, lo and behold, even though mankind is separate and has families that are not united, how does it actually end? Well, we see the story of the Tower of Babel. So God is so excited. Mankind, this is a model that seems to work. Separate families, not united families, and they still manage to come together. But what do they come together for? They don't come together for the family values and the Torah values that I clicked on something that God wants to build his world on, but rather they come together to challenge God. The Tower of Babel is about a group of people coming together and trying to literally challenge God. And what is their punishment? God separates them into different languages and different nations, totally separate. And so now God has to start a third time. It's not enough to do it twice, but he actually has to do this a third time as well. And who is the obvious choice for this to start with? Well, Abraham. And so he's going to start with Abraham. And by the way, this new model that he creates is different than before. He now decides, God says, well, I don't want to have one family. That was Adam's model. That didn't work. The Noach model was, well, we're going to have individual families and individual species. Everyone's just going to be separate. That didn't work. That led to the Tower of Babel. What about if we created a family that was also a nation, that was brought together by something else, something deeper bond, nationhood that connected them? How is Avram referred to in Parshat Lech Lecha? Av Hamon Goyim. He is the father of many Goyim, of many nations. One family, multiple families connected together through nationhood, right? Connected through Avraham. And what's interesting is that we see a huge shift in how God even begins to talk to, we see a huge shift in how God even describes the other nations of the world. I mean, in terms of how God even describes these different moments of recreating what the quote unquote perfect family looks like. When God is describing the generations of the Mabul, we notice here in verse 10 that when he lists all of them, El Todot Bnei Noach, Shem, Cham, Yafet, right? They all have what? The Mishbechotam Begoyehem. These are all children, right? So-and-so had a child and so-and-so had a child. They all had children, and they all had children, descendants, who were all part of their clan, their family. Following the story of later in chapter 11, we see that they're just listed, and they're not listed with any sense of mishbechotam. They're just listed here very differently. Just so-and-so has a child and so-and-so has a child. There's no families. It's just a bunch of individuals, and that doesn't work either until we come along with Abraham. So what is it that makes Abraham so special, that Abraham should be the one that continues this values, that Abraham, that this new should start this nation that also has a united family? What is so significant? So look how God describes in Parshat Vayera why he selects Abraham. Ki yedativ, because I knew. This is box 12 we're looking at, I'm sorry. Leman asher itzavet panav et beito acharav v'shamru derech Hashem lasot tzedakah u'mishpat leman havi Hashem Avram et asher diber lav. I've singled out Avram. Why? So he can instruct his children and those that come after him by doing what is just, derech Hashem, and that is right, lasot tzedakah, to make justice and order that God may bring about for Avram all that he had promised him. In other words, Avraham makes a commitment to pass on values to his children and to his children afterwards. In fact, when when the Torah tells us that Abraham was blessed bakol, he was blessed with everything, Rashi tells us that if you take the gematria, the alphanumerical value of the word bakol, it has the same gematria as the word bain, as the word son. In other words, when God blessed Avram with everything, he blessed him with a son. Because for Avram, starting a Jewish family was everything in life. And that's why he was selected. But the problem is that from Avraham all the way to the end of the book of Breshit, we see that this family never really coalesces and finalizes until really the next book, with the book of Shemot. In other words, if Avram was successful, what would we have called this new family model? What would our people be called? We would have been called what? Abramites, B'nai Avraham. That's what we would have been called. But what are we called instead? We're called B'nai Yisrael. We're called the Jewish people, B'nai Yisrael. Israelites, Israel meaning Yaakov. Why is it that we're not called from Abraham? And I think that the answer is that when we look back through the story, time and again, we see a big problem. We see sibling rivalry. By the way, sibling rivalry actually goes all the way back to the first story. If you think for a moment, the story of Cain and Hevel, sibling rivalry. We have in our Parsha, Parshat Noach, he has 3 sons. At the end of our Parsha, the 3 sons discover Noach. Shem, Ham, and Yafet discover him. 2 of the sons do something to the 3rd son. There's a rivalry between them. We find the same thing with Avram having 2 children. He has Yishmael and he has Yitzchak. There's a rivalry between them. Yitzchak has 2 sons, Yaakov and Esav. Yaakov has 12 sons, and they have their own problems with Yosef. And so time and again, we have this issue. And by the way, who time and again is the one who overcomes? Who would you expect to always be the one who comes out on top? The older son, the more mighty son, the eldest. But who ends up coming out time and again? The youngest child, always. Yosef is the youngest. Yaakov is the youngest. Yitzchak is the younger child. It's always the younger. It's not the way that you would think about it. And it's only after sibling rivalry is a thing of the past, when we find the end in Parshat Vayechi and the beginning of Shemot, do we see the Jewish people actually called being B'nai Yisrael, where they are living up to this one united family that God hoped for. And what's interesting here is that when there is one other example of sibling rivalry in the book of Breshit, there's one other example of siblings in the book of Breshit where there is no rivalry, and yet the younger once again outshines the older. Anyone know who that is? Ephraim and Menash. Ephraim and Menash, 2 sons of Yosef. So if Yosef, quote unquote, wins relative to his brothers, you have Ephraim and Menash. Who ends up getting the better bracha from Yaakov? Remember, Yaakov crosses his hands like this. So who gets the better bracha? The younger one wins. But does the Torah record any animosity between Menash and Ephraim? Is there any difficulty? There's nothing. How do we bless our children on Friday nights? What do we say? Yisimcha Elohim ke'Ephraim v'chim Menashe. We don't ask God to make our children, we don't ask them to be like Yaakov or Avraham or Yitzchak or anybody else for that matter, because we want them to be like Ephraim and Menash. We want our children to live in this ideal of the family that God hoped for, a united family where there's no rivalry, there's no pressure, there's no arguments between the siblings and between different individual family units. And so, in fact, this is such an important idea, children, that the Medrash itself tells us that when God wanted to give the Torah to the Jewish people, this is box number 13, and for the sake of time, I'll just say it outside. It's a beautiful midrash. Goes to asking them, who's going to be a guarantor? Who's going to ensure, right? You want to take this loan? You want to take this beautiful gift of the Torah? How do I know that you're going to actually accept it? How do we know you're going to hold up to your word? So what's the answer? So he turned, Avram will guarantee it, or Yitzchak or Yaakov. No, that's not going to work. Who is the guarantor? It's our children. Our children serve as the guarantor for us getting the Torah, which is why it is our children, i.e., it is future generations that suffer when we don't follow God's Torah. And once again, this is all about God creating the family unit, this nationhood, this Jewish people as being so important for our survival. So nowadays we know, though, that many people are a part of both families and nations, right? You have your own family. There's the Lehrfield family. And as a Lehrfield family, I'm also a U.S. citizen. I'm also Americans. Please God, I get to vote, right? I've got great rights. So I'm part of a nation, but I'm also part of a family. But for us as Jews, those ideas actually come together as one. That is the ideal. When we see ourselves as being both family and family, being united family in nationhood, in the model of Bnei Yisrael that comes after years of sibling rivalry, where we don't have animosity one to the next, where we don't have any challenges between individual families, between sections of Jews hating Jews, Orthodox, conservative, Reform, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. When we see ourselves as one people, one nation, and a united family, despite our differences, so then we can find redemption. And redemption comes about, we see in the story of the Exodus from Egypt. How does the Jewish people actually get redeemed? They're not redeemed as individual family units. Even though they come down, there's many families. We see, in fact, when the Jewish people encamp around the Mishkan, their individual families. The Torah tells us that redemption, Geula, comes for a nation, comes for the Bnei Yisrael, one unit, Am Bnei Yisrael, the nation who are also the children of Israel, this duality that comes together. And that's really what we have to strive for as well. And in fact, when Eliyahu Hanavi comes, please God, to be the foreboding of Mashiach, the Mishnah in Edios tells us that what is Eliyahu's specific job? It's unbelievable. Amar Rabbi Yeshua, Mekabel ani Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai, Sheshama Rabba Merabba. I heard from Yochanan ben Zakkai, I heard from his teacher and his teachers before him, Halacha Moshe Sinai, a halacha that was given directly from Moshe from Sinai, that what? She'ein Eliyahu ba l'tamei l'taher. The role of Elijah, we pray Eliyahu should come. It's not to come to make things pure or impure. L'rachek u'akarev l'rachek ha'mekarvan b'zroa u'akarev ha'merchakim b'zroa. What is his role? It's not to pronounce things that are unclean or clean, or to put away or bring people near, to put away those brought near by force, to bring by force. I misread. Eliyahu was not to come to pronounce unclean or to pronounce clean or to put away or to bring near, but to put away those brought near by force and to bring those who are brought forth by force, right? To bring people together. And this Mishnah continues and expands upon that elsewhere. In other words, Eliyahu's role is specifically to reunite families who are pulled away. And this is what the last psukim in Malachi mean. Hine ani shalech lachem et Eliyahu Hanavi, v'heishiv leiv avot al banim, leiv banim al avotam. I send you Eliyahu, what? For he shall turn the heart of the fathers to the children, and the heart of the children to their fathers. In other words, redemption in our world, no different than in the time of Noach, when Noach and his family is redeemed, only comes when we have a united family together. And by the way, Mashiach comes when all of humanity, when the entire human world goes back to that original ideal that God created with the first man, when all of mankind comes and unites as families, when that ideal is realized, that's when Mashiach comes. And that's what Eliyahu is supposed to do. He's supposed to be the foreboder, the one who helps us get to that point, helps us bring us to that state of redemption. And so that's what we're aiming to achieve. And so when we find differences in our community, in our own families, we have to see the bigger picture and realize that that is not part of God's divine plan. And that's not what God wants from us. And that is not how we go about finding redemption. And I pray that we find the strength to do that and bring Mashiach speedily in our days. So with that, we will stop here. We once again thank the Lipsy family, thank Ivor Lipsy, who sponsored in honor of his father's birthday. Happy birthday to Bernard. And it's great to get back to our regularly scheduled learning. And I can't wait to see everyone same time, same place, same bat channel next week.
All right. Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi. It's good to see you and good to see everybody. Hope everyone is well, safe, and happy.